BookTube, and welcome to BookTrek 2021. This is a 5-month mission that I've embarked on with a group of other great booktubers, where we are reading Star Trek books. We're reading Star Trek books for the rest of the year. We're splitting the year up. Month by month, we'll be franchise by franchise. So we'll start off with Star Trek, the original series, for the month of August. And then we'll go to the Next Generation in September, then Deep Space Nine in October, then Voyager in November, and finally Star Trek Enterprise in December. So in 2021, we are not dealing with any of the problematic Star Trek. We're not dealing with the Abrams verse. We're not dealing with the Kelvin timeline. We're not dealing with Star Trek Discovery, known to its many detractors as STD. We're not dealing with Star Trek Picard. We're not dealing with Lower Decks. We're not dealing with anything like that. We're dealing just with the big main franchises. The failure sandwich, as a friend of mine calls it, because the original Star Trek had 3 seasons. It didn't last the full 7 to get to syndication, a great syndication deal. Still went into syndication. Of course, that's where most people found it. And then you have massively popular franchises that did go for 7 seasons. They had large cast, great work, dedicated fans. And then finally you have Star Trek Enterprise, which was the first series since the original series to get canceled instead of coming to a dignified ending, instead of ending after 7 seasons when everybody involved could be guaranteed to have, you know, all the residuals in the world. We're just dealing with those for 2021, and that's fine by me. Star Trek, the original series, is my Star Trek. I have found something to love in almost every franchise that has happened since then. Maybe not so much with Star Trek The Next Generation, but even there, some. The only Star Trek franchise that I've ever found absolutely nothing to like, where it isn't Star Trek, where there's nothing for me to latch, aside from the Kelvin, the J.J. Abrams movies, which are big and surgically brainless. Just the dumbest movies I have ever seen. The dumbest movies of any kind that I have ever seen. Aside from them, Star Trek Discovery is the only iteration of Star Trek that I'm just watching and saying I could flush this whole thing down the outhouse and I wouldn't miss it for a fraction of a second. I can't say that about Star Trek The Next Generation or any of the others. The others engendered genuine love, genuine affection in me, but nothing quite so much as the original series. The original series I loved when no one knew that Star Trek was going to be anything. Couldn't wait for every new episode. So I'm going to have a blast reading Star Trek novels in August, and I've set myself some parameters. I'm not going back to old favorites. I have a large number, about 3 dozen old favorites in Star Trek fiction, original Star Trek fiction. Books that I know well, that I've read many times and loved, that I've recommended to many people, bought for many people. I'm going to try not to do that in August. I'm going to try to go to books that I've read only once, maybe when they first came out, or that I didn't think much of, or that seemed incidental, that sort of thing. And that's what we're doing today. I also was on the fence a little about how many videos I should make, right? Because I'm in this with Gina Stanyer and Mark Richardson and Michael K Vaughan and our leader, our dear leader, Vin at Revenant Reads. And I don't think any of them, I make a lot of videos. I love making videos. I set aside time for it every day to talk to you about all kinds of bookish things. And I was sort of on the fence about how many videos I should make, but several of my own event co-hosts are saying I should make a video every day. So I didn't make one yesterday, but I'm going to make one today, and I'll try not to miss another day in August. And the book that I'm going to today, I'm occasionally glancing at the numbers on these things. These things were numbered. They're not in any kind of real, books in a series numbering sequence, but nevertheless, they were numbered, I think, to enhance the collectability, to get people to want to get them all. And I haven't really paid attention to where I'm jumping around. I'm fairly late in the franchise with the book that I'm doing today. This is Meld by John Vornhold. John Vornhold did a lot of Star Trek fiction. A lot. I'm not sure how much original Star Trek he wrote. But this book, it brings up a couple of elements in Star Trek, the original series, just in general, that we can talk about. Some we've already mentioned, others maybe not. One of the elements that we've already mentioned is the Mary Sue. The concept of the Mary Sue. A new invented character, almost always female, who comes on to the show and outdoes everyone else. It takes center stage away from the people we are here and paying our $5.95 to read about. This novel is set after Star Trek The Undiscovered Country, so very late in the career of our crew on board the Enterprise. A lot of the members of that crew will go on to have long careers after this, but this is one of the last times they'll be together as a crew on a ship. And it takes place in the immediate aftermath of Star Trek The Undiscovered Country. That's a pretty big aftermath. That's the collapse of the Klingon Empire. That's a radical re-altering of the relationship between humans and Klingons. That's an attempted assassination of the President of the United Federation of Planets, thwarted personally by Jim Kirk, and a number of other things. A number of other elements involved in that. You could, in other words, write straight up Star Trek fiction for volume after volume and not exhaust the actual aftermath of that movie. The movies are automatically canon. They're de facto canon. And the books, by this point, are operating as the shadow canon of the whole thing. So nothing's going to happen in a book that is contradicted by any movie or by any TV show. There's a big Bible for the series that is now circulated widely so that writers are not going to go wild. They're not going to go, as the old and discredited saying goes, off the reservation. This is the story of the reunification of Vulcan and Romulan and the Romulan Empire. In Balance of Terror, in the original Star Trek series, we learned that Romulans look just like Vulcans. And in that episode, humans fought a war with Romulans, but they'd never seen them. And in that episode, we learn that Mr. Spock conveys the speculation that the Romulans were an offshoot of his own people. Only violent, emotional, where they did not have the teachings of Surak, they did not have the philosophy of logic. But that explains why they look the same, because they're an offshoot of the Vulcan race that didn't offshoot all that long ago. And in another episode of the original series, Journey to Babel, again, there's an offhand line. Spock makes an offhand line that Rigelians, that the inhabitants of the star system of Rigel, the star Rigel, are physiologically very similar to Vulcans. Doesn't say anything more than that, but fans ran with it and have said that Rigelians are essentially another offshoot of Vulcans, even to the question of whether or not they look like Vulcans, whether or not you could pick a Vulcan and a Rigelian apart in a crowd. This novel is very much about that subject matter. We learn in Star Trek The Next Generation that a decades and decades old Mr. Spock has dedicated his life to reunifying the Romulan and Vulcan people. Some of you remember the episode in which he brings Captain Picard and Data into that struggle that he's devoted decades to. And in that episode of The Next Generation, we'll be getting to The Next Generation. We're going to talk a lot about them next month. In that episode, Spock realizes that he has been betrayed by his old friend, Senator Pardek, a Romulan Senator Pardek, who he's known for 70 years. He's betrayed by him anyway. And in that, I'm sure I'm not the only person who found the conclusion of that episode when Pardek's treachery is revealed and he takes as his reward for betraying a friend he's known for 70 years, he takes an offhanded thank you from a Romulan proconsul and just steps into the background. No other motivation, no explanation given for how someone like Spock could not know. After 70 minutes, maybe. 70 hours, maybe. 70 days, maybe. 70 years, he knows this guy and doesn't have any idea that the guy doesn't believe him, doesn't trust him, is working to betray him. 70 years? One way or another, I myself think that details like that, details in that episode and in many, many other episodes in Star Trek The Next Generation, reveal that Star Trek The Next Generation would make a whole lot more sense if it had happened 30 years after the original series, instead of nearly 80 years after the original series. That was done intentionally by Roddenberry and his showrunners to sever all ties with the original show. So there won't be any slop over. So we won't have to deal with it. And that once Star Trek The Next Generation became incredibly popular, that became non-lucrative. You did want to have as many connections with the original series as possible. And so you have people end up being alive or coming alive, or all sorts of intersections. Star Trek: The Next Generation starts with a guest cameo appearance by Bones McCoy at 117 years old. He just lived the 70 years in between the two franchises. But it also gives us lots of others. We get Ambassador Sarek, we get Scotty, we get a whole bunch of other connections between the one and then, of course, famously in the movie, Kirk and Picard meet. But anyway, this novel finds Mr. Spock, an older, seasoned Mr. Spock. This is after the Undiscovered Country, so our crew has been together on a new enterprise. They have had a new adventure together, and Spock is very much concerned with the reunification of the Romulan and Vulcan people. And so is his father, Ambassador Sarek. And an event has been arranged to convince the powers that be in both the Vulcan Science Council and the Romulan Empire that the Vulcans and the Romulans are really one people, and that they should be reunified. And that event is a marriage, a betrothal, a bespoken marriage, an arranged marriage between a Vulcan girl, Teska, the little girl on the cover here, Spock's niece, and a Romulan boy. The reasoning being that if they can undergo the same procedure that Mr. Spock underwent, in the original series of Muck Time, we learned that Spock himself was bonded with a young girl when they were children, so that when the appointed time came, they would meet and mate. Parted from thee, but never parted, never and always touching and touched. They mind meld, and that creates a bond between the two of them. Spock and Sarek and a few other people, including Senator Pardek, but no one's reading this book doesn't know that Pardek is a traitor. Pardek is introduced in the episode in which he is revealed as a traitor, so no one knows that name except that knows how that plot is going to come out. One way or another, all those people are thinking in the exposition dumps in this book that if that mating ritual is successful between the little Romulan boy and Teska, well, then everybody will know that the Romulans and the Vulcans are one people and deserve one destiny together. And again, like I mentioned last time, that just underscores that science fiction and Star Trek novels in particular bring along with them the technology of their own time. They can't help but do it, unless it's actually written by a full-fledged and really talented futurist, someone who really can look at the future, extrapolate well by the present to get a good idea of the future. Those are rare. You would think that science fiction as a genre would be chock-a-block with them, but no. Most people go to science fiction because it's a good gig, it's a good paycheck. Most of them don't do it for evangelical reasons. And you don't have to be more than 50 pages into this book, if you're in the 21st century, in 2021, to be saying, why put two kids, just have a genetic test. Just do genetic testing. The genome of the Romulan genome and the Vulcan genome will be fully mapped. Of course, when John Vornholt wrote this book, even the genome of the dog or the housefly had not been mapped. It was not on his radar, I guess, because you wouldn't do this. You would, if you wanted to convince people that these were two people who were the same, you would have a genetic test. You wouldn't put two kids through a betrothal. But one way or another, the plot does do that. And it involves a lot about Rigelians. John Vornholt clearly wants to get an oar in the water as far as just how Vulcan are Rigelians. In their culture, in their physiology, maybe even are they telepathic. You notice that the Next Generation tried to sort of distance itself from the whole idea. I mean, the ultimate ruling reason why the Romulans in Balance of Terror looked like Vulcans is because Gene Roddenberry had a tiny special effects budget. That's the main reason. We work it out from there. The writers they worked with what they had, but the main reason was purely practical. And that wasn't true with Star Trek The Next Generation, which had a much bigger effects budget, and therefore the Romulans start to look a little more alien. They have blockish bridges in addition to looking like Vulcans. They look like Vulcans, but not identical to Vulcans. I didn't agree with that decision when the Romulans were reintroduced in, I think, the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation. I didn't agree with that decision. I wanted them to look just like Vulcans and just explore that rather than give them a prosthesis on the forehead. But one way or another, certainly that decision makes this book and the whole ethos that's guiding it a lot harder to really run with, right? If the Romulans are so different that they have different bone structures, then probably they are different species. Probably this plot wouldn't work. Probably they are not able to interbreed. So how you can even question anything like that when Spock himself is a hybrid of a human and a Vulcan, one way or another. If the comic books can have Superman and Lois Lane have a perfectly functional baby, then I suppose anything's possible. But Spock takes on the guidance of young Teska in this book, and they have adventures together. They eventually find themselves on the run from the Romulans and from a criminal syndicate that's far more interesting than anything else in the book. And in the course of their adventures, Teska more and more becomes a Mary Sue, and that's disappointing, especially in a Star Trek novel this late in the franchise, when presumably, I mean, I've not seen any new iterations of that series Bible, but presumably it also stresses that you must not have Mary Sues. You must not fall back on that. Or maybe not. As I mentioned, Star Trek Discovery is a Mary Sue story. There are all sorts of things that happen incidentally around it, but the core, the living, beating heart of Star Trek The Discovery is a Mary Sue story. Purely a Mary Sue story. A female character who is better than anybody at everything, who's beloved by everybody except the villains, and that's how you can tell they're villains, and who never has any kind of doubt or character arc. That is pure Mary Sue, and that's what the whole show is based on. It's still disappointing to find it in a novel like this, especially written by an old hand. I could have done with Teska being more like a frightened child in this book than she ever is. She would have been, even with Vulcan training. She doesn't come off much like a little girl in this book, and that bothered me. Another thing that bothered me about this book is another element that we're going to be talking about when it comes to the next generation, which is time. The element of time. For the very first time in any popular science fiction franchise, time becomes an element in Star Trek. Because we see our crew, if you were watching in the 1960s, you saw this crew as young people. Even McCoy was young. Punching people, karate chopping people, falling in love, falling out of love, having vigorous adventures. Then years pass and we get Star Trek the Motion Picture, and then we get Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, which actually mentions age. Star Trek the Motion Picture is just a continuation of Star Trek. Everybody's moved on a little, but they're getting back together. Star Trek II, Nicholas Meyer, the director, actually has Jim Kirk mention that he's not young anymore. And that just gets more pronounced as time goes on. By the time you get to the movie, The Undiscovered Country, which is a terrific movie, I strongly recommend watching it if you haven't watched it. The ideal circumstance to watch it is with your belly swollen with home-cooked Vermont food at around 11:30 at night, with jugs of wine wide open on the old oak coffee table, on a big screen TV, sitting in the same room with Mark Richardson. Now, I'm not sure how many of you will have the opportunity in your lives to watch it under those circumstances, but I can tell you, those are the ideal circumstances to watch the movie. It's great anyway. It's fantastic, but it's unmistakable that the characters in that movie are old. They are not young anymore. And time has moved on in the continuity of the movie. It's not like they're still, in the same Enterprise. They're on a different ship. They have lionized careers outside of the Enterprise. It's a rare and unusual thing that any of our crew will be together. It feels that way. And of course, in Undiscovered Country, the crew is not all together, because Sulu, who is a boy in Star Trek, the original series, is the captain of a starship. He joins his crew, but only in command of his own vessel. He doesn't get back at the helm. That element, the element of time passing, is present in this book whether Vornholt wants it to be or not. And it was a thing that I kept thinking the whole time that I was reading this, which was, this takes place right after the events of The Undiscovered Country. We have the most lionized and experienced crew in all of Starfleet history at tenterhooks. They're at ends. They're not on the Enterprise. They don't have a current mission. I want to read about that. I want to read about them. That story is far more interesting than Teska's escapades. Far more interesting, no matter what Vornholt can do. This is actually a very readable book. If you can get over the fact that it's all about Teska all the time, it's a very readable book. It's very enjoyable. I seem to remember that's true of all Vornholt's Star Trek fiction. I don't think he wrote anything that I didn't like. We'll probably be getting to him again. I don't think with the original series, but he's all over the other franchises. We're bound to encounter him again. This is an enjoyable read, despite its drawbacks. For instance, how is Teska Spock's niece? Is it flat-footed of me to ask that? In order for her to be Spock's niece, doesn't Spock need a sibling? Isn't that how nieces and nephews go? Doesn't he need a sibling? And as far as we know, even if you stretch continuity to include Star Trek V, which most fans don't do, even if you stretch continuity to include Jim Kirk duking it out with God, okay, in that movie, in Star Trek V, we meet Sybok, who is a half-brother of Spock. He's a son of Sarek. It didn't seem to me from that movie that Sybok had much time or inclination to have children that were raised on Vulcan. And even if he did, I'm pretty sure Teska would be a lot older than she is in this book. We don't know. Spock doesn't have any other siblings. Michael Burnham doesn't count. So he doesn't have any other siblings. So how is she his niece? It's never really that strongly addressed. It's instead of saying a cousin might work, but instead, no. We know that Spock has kin. Right? In Amok Time, we're told that he's related, somehow, to T'Pau, the only person ever to turn down a seat on the Federation High Council. He's a relative of hers. That's why she's presiding at his Kunat Khalifi. But so you could have said cousin. You didn't have to say niece. One way or another. If you can overlook all that stuff, this is an entertaining novel to read, especially as the action picks up. I got the impression there's a lot of action right in the middle, and then there's a really good conclusion. And I got the impression when I was reading those action sequences that maybe Vornholt likes to write that and was feeling a little bit constrained by the book that he had to follow for this. But even if you enjoy this book on its own merits, I bet a lot of you are still going to be in the same position as I am, which is enough of this business with Romulan and Vulcan reunification, especially since we know how it turns out. I want to hear about the crew. Are they going to work on the Enterprise? Are they going to stick together? What's it like that they've been in Starfleet for so long that they become living legends? That's more interesting than any story that is in this book, or that's in a lot of books set in this time in Star Trek, the original series fiction. That's the problem that you have when you introduce time as an active narrative element. Suddenly, it gains a momentum of its own. And you might not like that, but you can't ignore it. If you ignore it, you get books like this, where half the readers are going to wish that you weren't ignoring it. And they just are. I was, and I have a wide open mind for Star Trek fiction. So, your Star Trek for today is Mind Meld. And it's very good. It won't work at all for a non-Star Trek fan. You not only have to know Star Trek The Next Generation really well, but you have to know Star Trek backstory really well. You have to care how closely the Rigelians are connected to the Romulans or to the Vulcans. You have to care about the differences that have already been shown in canon between Romulans and Vulcans. All that sort of thing. You also have to turn a blind eye if you're a Star Trek fan. The Undiscovered Country, the movie, it's really, really good. It has some really cheer-worthy moments, but it also has one of the darkest moments, I would say the darkest moment, period, in all of Star Trek. Any franchise at any time. And if you're going to write about a Mr. Spock in this book, as Vornholt does, without writing extensively about the Mr. Spock in that dark moment, a lot of you will know the moment that I'm talking about. It takes place on the bridge of the Enterprise under the command of James T. Kirk, where a character named Saavik has essential knowledge, tactical knowledge, to save the Federation from war, to save the life of the Federation president. And she's obviously not going to share that knowledge, and Spock is right there on the bridge. And when it becomes obvious that she isn't going to share that information, Kirk just looks at Spock. He doesn't even hesitate. He doesn't even have to say it. He doesn't have to give the order. Spock just volunteers. He just walks forward into a forced mind meld with that character in order to take the knowledge from her guarded, unwilling brain. And the actress who plays Saavik also plays Samantha on Sex and the City, and she leaves no doubt in that scene. It's a perfect performance. She leaves no doubt about what's happening. Okay? She leaves no doubt about what's happening. We can dress it up in science fiction or fanciful concepts like mind melds, all we like, but what happens in that scene is a rape. And it's done by Mr. Spock with Jim Kirk's enthusiastic approval in front of everyone. Didn't need to be. Even if you're going to do it, it didn't need to be done in front of everyone on the bridge. You could take an extra minute. I am a longtime Star Trek fan. I absolutely love the original series, and I have never been able to make my peace with that moment. Never. I don't think I ever will be. I think you'd have to be a monster to be able to make your peace with that moment. It ought to disturb you, and it ought to overshadow any book that stars that character. At least a little. I'm not saying, morbidly dwell on it, but just to go from that moment directly. This book is in the direct shadow of the movie Undiscovered Country. To go from that moment directly to a novel that's just Mr. Spock's wacky adventures with his niece, there's something about that just I read this book, and I admit, when I read it the first time, when it first came out, I didn't really think about that all that much. I've thought about that more and more as time has gone on, and when I reread it for BookTrek 2021, I got to about the halfway point. There's a kind of a thrilling 39 steps sequence around the halfway point of the book. Really well done. I was totally caught up in it, but when the sequence was over and I realized that I was no longer being manipulated by the author, I confess, I'm not trying to be a brat here, I confess that when I finished that scene, a bravura little scene, a big part of my mind took a step back and asked the simple question, how's Saavik? That sort of takes the top spin off Spock's wacky adventures. So sorry, I didn't mean to let this particular BookTrek get all dark and broody, but that is an amazing scene. It's still amazing to me that Paramount allowed that scene into the movie. I guess they must have just thought, if it's dressed up in science fiction-y terms, then it's not so bad. You tell me what you think, if you know the scene I'm talking about. And if you don't know the scene I'm talking about, feel free to watch the movie. And then you tell me what you make of that moment. Tell me if it changes your perception of the character. One way or another, that is your book for today. It is a late Star Trek, the original series book. In show continuity, it can't be much later than this that our crew was never together again, and probably before this. So that is late in the storylines, right? After this, if you're going to do a Star Trek novel set after this, you're going to be verging into the Lost Era books, that take place in that long 70 years between the original series and the Next Generation. You're not going to be talking about original Star Trek anymore at all. This is about as late as you can get with that, because it has all of the original cast in here. Almost all of the original cast in here. So there you go. I think for tomorrow, I will probably venture much, much further back in time. We'll be dealing with a much younger crew. We'll see. We'll see. It strikes my fancy. I pick my books in the afternoon. I read them at night. So I'm going to pick a book today, and we'll find out what we talk about tomorrow. Tomorrow, I'm hoping, will be a lot less grim. So I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.